Chapter 1. A Quiet Afternoon in St. Mary Mead. It was a mild Thursday afternoon in early October, and the village of St. Mary Mead lay basking under a sky the colour of milky tea. The leaves had begun their slow descent into golden decay, drifting lazily onto hedgerows and lawns. The chimneys of the cottages puffed out faint streams of smoke, and the scent of damp earth mingled with that of stewed apples. Miss Jane Marple sat by the parlour window of her cottage on the high street, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pair of thick socks for her nephew Raymond. A small smile played on her lips as she watched the world pass by. Miss Weatherby, as usual, hurrying back from the grocer's with her shopping basket bouncing against her hip, and old Mr. Cleet arguing with the postman about whether the parcel for number 10 truly needed a signature. All was just as it ought to be, orderly, familiar, and comfortingly dull. That is, until the arrival of a rather flashy motor car disrupted the peaceful harmony. The vehicle, a dark blue Humber with polished chrome and a somewhat out-of-place grandeur, rumbled up the lane and came to a halt just outside the village green. It was not a car known to the villagers, and in St. Mary Mead the unknown was not often welcome. Miss Marple paused mid-row. "Now I wonder," she murmured softly. The door of the car opened, and out stepped a tall man in his late 30s, smartly dressed in a pinstripe suit with a silk cravat knotted carelessly about his throat. From the passenger side emerged a woman in a rich, plum-coloured coat, the sort of fashion one might see in London, not rural England. The couple exchanged a few words, glanced around as though trying to get their bearings, then walked briskly up the lane that led to Fernleigh Hall. Now that was a name not uttered often these days. Fernleigh Hall, once the grandest residence in St. Mary Mead, had been left to moulder after the death of Sir Cedric Wareham some 15 years ago. It had remained shut up and mostly forgotten, save for the occasional visit from an estate agent or a nosy historian. It was said to be under the care of a distant niece, or perhaps a cousin. No one quite knew. So when Miss Marple's good friend, Mrs. Dolly Bantry, telephoned later that evening with the most delicious piece of gossip, Miss Marple was not surprised. "You'll never guess who's taken the lease on Fernleigh Hall." Dolly's voice crackled down the line with excitement. "A Mr. Marcus Fleetwood owns half a publishing house in London, and his sister, Miss Cordelia Fleetwood. No children, no husband, simply dripping with money. The place is being made up like something out of country life. Gardens cleared, windows polished, new furniture delivered." "How very curious," murmured Miss Marple. "Curious, my dear Jane, it's positively thrilling." Dolly lowered her voice, even though they were on the telephone. "And you'll never believe this, there are whispers. Apparently they've brought with them a nurse. A nurse, Jane, and why would two perfectly healthy young people require a nurse?" Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes narrowed just slightly. The following day, the Fleetwoods made their formal appearance in the village, cordial enough, if a trifle reserved. Marcus Fleetwood was charming, with an easy laugh and a way of speaking that suggested he'd rather be anywhere than stuck in a small country village. Cordelia, on the other hand, was striking and remote, with sharply lined lips and eyes that missed nothing. They visited the vicarage, exchanged pleasantries at the grocer's, and took tea at the Bluebell Tea Room. The nurse, a sturdy woman named Miss Keene, was not introduced, but observed from a distance. She appeared stern, no-nonsense, and possessed a stare that would quell a schoolboy mid-prank. Over the next fortnight, small oddities began to ripple through the village. Mrs. Perry, the charwoman at Fernleigh, mentioned, without being asked, that the upper rooms of the hall were locked, and she was only permitted to clean downstairs. Mr. Cartwright, the milkman, noted the large number of prescription bottles delivered to the house, though he wasn't certain who they were for. And young Lily Dawes, who worked part-time in the garden, claimed she'd heard someone weeping late one afternoon. "Sounded like an old lady, miss," she said nervously to her mother, "but I never saw anyone else in the house." By the third week, the whispers had grown louder. Dolly Bantry paid another visit to Miss Marple, this time in person, her cheeks flushed and her voice hushed. "Jane," she said, clutching her handbag tightly, "you'll think I'm being fanciful, but I swear something is not right. I called at Fernleigh yesterday and saw Cordelia Fleetwood in the garden. She looked utterly distracted, kept glancing over her shoulder, and when I tried to engage her in conversation, she brushed me off in the most peculiar way." Miss Marple listened carefully, offering Dolly a scone and nodding in her gentle, attentive fashion. "And then this morning," Dolly continued, I overheard Mrs. Tilling say that Nurse Keene was asking questions about the old well behind the orchard. Apparently it hasn't been touched in years. What business could she have poking around there?" Miss Marple folded her hands on her lap. "Well, Dolly, I dare say you are not being fanciful at all. People seldom behave strangely without reason, especially not in villages like ours. Do you think something's going on?" "I think," said Miss Marple calmly, "that there is something not quite right about the Fleetwoods, but time, Dolly, has a way of revealing all manner of secrets." And indeed, within a week, the secrets began to unravel. For on the morning of the harvest fair, as the villagers were decorating the green with bunting and arranging prize marrows on wooden tables, a terrible cry rang out from Fernleigh Hall. It was Lily Dawes, pale and shaking, who had gone to tend the rose garden and instead found someone hidden under the ivy-covered trellis near the side gate. The body of Nurse Keene, lying very still, quite dead. Chapter 2. The Whisper Behind the Garden Gate. The body of Nurse Keene was discovered just after 10 o'clock on Saturday morning, the very hour Mrs. Price was placing her rhubarb tart in the judging tent at the harvest fair. St. Mary Mead, so often a quiet stage for the small dramas of village life, suddenly found itself host to a more sinister performance. By 10:30, Constable Rogers had been summoned. He arrived puffing from the exertion of having to fetch Inspector Craddock from Much Benham. Rogers, bless him, had neither the stomach nor the subtlety for anything more taxing than a stolen bicycle or the occasional disturbance at the pub. Miss Marple, of course, was already at the fair. She had entered a pot of strawberry jam and had taken a modest 3rd place, to her great satisfaction. Word of the grim discovery reached her by way of young Tommy Cartwright, who came sprinting across the green with his cap in his hand and fear on his face. "Miss Marple, there's been... Well, it's Nurse Keene, miss. They say she's been murdered." Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly, but her tone was quite composed. "Oh dear," she said, setting down her knitting with the calm of a woman quite used to dark shadows hiding behind lace curtains. "Where was she found?" "Near the garden gate at Fernleigh Hall, miss, by the trellis just beside the orchard wall." "Thank you, Tommy. That will be all for now. Run along and tell your mother where you are." Miss Marple turned, her blue eyes clouded with concern, but no real surprise. She had always believed something dark was nestled in Fernleigh's bones. A house cannot remain closed for so long without keeping secrets. By the time Inspector Craddock arrived, the green was buzzing. Bunting fluttered, but the cheerful sounds of the fair had dulled. Only the band from Lower Bramble continued playing, unaware of the scandal unfolding just up the lane. Miss Marple made her way toward Fernleigh Hall slowly and without drama. She had known Inspector Craddock since he was a young constable, and he, in turn, had learned to recognize that Miss Marple's observations, no matter how gently offered, tended to outpace even the sharpest Scotland Yard report. The hall looked both stately and unsettled. Police had already cordoned off the side garden where Nurse Keene had been found. A stretcher was being carried through the orchard, and Miss Marple, though she didn't approach the body, had seen enough in her lifetime to suspect what the constable had confirmed. Nurse Keene had been struck once, hard and clean, at the back of the head. "A nasty business," said Craddock, frowning as he joined her at the edge of the lane. No signs of a struggle. She was probably taken by surprise. Miss Marple nodded gently. "That would be in keeping with her character, don't you think?" Craddock raised a brow. "You knew her?" "I observed her," Miss Marple said simply. "She was a professional woman, efficient but not popular. I've seen how the butcher's wife looked away when she entered, and how the vicar's housekeeper crossed the street. I don't believe she was unkind, merely private, which is often enough to rouse suspicion in a place like this." "Did she have any family?" "Not that I know of. She appeared wholly committed to her duties at Fernleigh, which makes one wonder," Miss Marple added delicately, "what those duties truly were." Craddock gave a wry smile. "You're thinking what I'm thinking." "Possibly. I imagine you're wondering why 2 wealthy siblings in excellent health would need a nurse." "And why she needed locking drawers in her bedroom," Craddock said grimly. They were forced open sometime in the night. Papers taken. Miss Marple's brows rose slightly. How very deliberate. Whoever killed her knew what they wanted and where to find it. Just then the front door opened, and Marcus Fleetwood stepped out. He was pale, but held himself with composure. Cordelia followed closely behind, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "We're in utter shock," Marcus said to the inspector. "We've had Nurse Keene with us for 5 years. She's like, well, was like, part of the family." "Was she?" Miss Marple asked softly, more to herself than anyone else. Cordelia turned sharply towards her, her voice edged with emotion. "You don't know what you're talking about. She was part of the family. She helped look after our aunt, our late aunt. She stayed on to manage some of the estate's affairs." "Your aunt?" Craddock echoed, flipping through his notebook. "There's no record of a Miss or Mrs. Fleetwood residing at Fernleigh Hall recently." "She passed away last winter," Marcus said. "In France. She had a villa near Nice. We brought her remains back and buried her at the family plot. Nurse Keene handled the arrangements." "Curious," said Craddock. "There's no mention of that either in the local registry." Miss Marple, her voice mild, said, "May I ask, did your aunt leave Fernleigh Hall to you both in her will?" Cordelia's lips tightened. Marcus hesitated. "There was a complicated arrangement," he said at last. "We inherited the lease, but some matters were still being finalized. It's all in the hands of our solicitor." Craddock nodded slowly. "We'll need to see those papers, Mr. Fleetwood, and we'll be speaking again once we've looked over Nurse Keene's effects." The siblings retreated indoors, and Craddock turned to Miss Marple with a sigh. "Too many shadows here," he said. "Too many questions." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the upper windows of the house. "Yes," she agreed, "and I believe some of the answers may lie not with the living but with the absent." "Absent?" "A woman buried quietly abroad," she said. "A nurse whose duties involved more than mere care. And a house that has remained quiet far too long. The past, Inspector," she added thoughtfully, "has a way of clinging to places like ivy on stone. You can try to cut it back, but the roots are always deeper than you expect." And as the sun slipped behind the grey clouds that afternoon, the villagers of St. Mary Mead carried their prize vegetables and jam jars home, talking in whispers, wondering what might be revealed next behind the ivy-covered walls of Fernleigh Hall. Chapter 3. Secrets in the Attic. The following morning dawned grey and wind-swept, with the church bells of St. Mary Mead sounding more mournful than usual. A fine drizzle misted the windows of Miss Marple's sitting room as she poured herself a cup of tea and reflected on the curious nature of death, particularly when it came to Nurse Keene. She had not known the woman personally, of course, but she had seen enough of her in passing, at the baker's, the chemist's, even once at the library, where she had borrowed a copy of Nursing Practices of the Modern Age, a choice Miss Marple had noted with interest. Not for its contents, but for the way Nurse Keene had clutched it, almost protectively. Now the nurse was dead, and secrets, like old moths, were stirring from the shadows of Fernleigh Hall. Later that morning, Miss Marple was not entirely surprised to receive a discreet knock at her front door. It was Inspector Craddock, shoulders dusted with rain, his expression tight with concern. "I don't suppose," he said after she had invited him in, "you'd like to take a walk with me back to Fernleigh? There are developments." Miss Marple put on her sensible shoes and her most inconspicuous hat, the one with a feather that had long given up the will to stand upright, and accompanied the inspector without fuss. The lane to Fernleigh was slick with damp leaves, the trees overhead swaying like silent witnesses to unfolding drama. "Did you speak again with Mr. and Miss Fleetwood?" Miss Marple asked lightly. Craddock gave a grim nod. "Reluctant to share much," Cordelia especially. She's either hiding something or frightened, or both. I imagine it may be both, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Fear often wears the mask of coldness. When they arrived at Fernleigh, the place seemed more alive than it had since the Fleetwood's arrival. A police photographer was taking careful shots of the garden trellis, and a young constable stood guard near the side gate. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with unease. Craddock led Miss Marple up the grand staircase, its carpeted steps creaking beneath their feet. We searched Nurse Keene's room last night, he said. But this morning, Constable Hartley went up to check a noise reported by the housekeeper, Mrs. Perry. She thought she heard someone moving about on the upper floor. Which is supposed to be empty, Miss Marple said. Precisely. They reached the upper landing, where a narrow corridor stretched towards a small, locked door. Craddock produced a key and opened it with a click. The attic was long, low-ceilinged, and full of dust. Trunks, broken chairs, and forgotten furniture filled the corners, all coated in a film of age. But at the far end was a smaller space, curtained off with heavy fabric, where the air felt markedly colder. Inside was a room, a bedroom, or what once had been one. A small iron-framed bed stripped bare, a washstand, cracked and stained, a wardrobe with its door hanging loose, and beside the bed a tattered lace shawl half-folded. Miss Marple stepped in gently, like one entering a memory. She lived here, she said quietly. Craddock nodded. We believe Nurse Keene may have kept someone here. An elderly person, perhaps bedridden. And no one in the village saw her? No, Craddock said, but it would explain the nurse, the deliveries, the secrecy. Miss Marple walked to the washstand and picked up a small glass bottle. The label was mostly rubbed away, but her eyes read what little remained. Laudanum. Her lips tightened. Whoever lived here, she said, was not meant to be found. This was a hidden life. Craddock looked around the sad little space. We've sent for a medical examiner. There may have been a death that went unreported, or worse. Or perhaps, Miss Marple murmured, a person who is still very much alive, but missing. Downstairs, Mrs. Perry had been summoned for questioning. The housekeeper was a local woman in her 50s, practical and sharp-eyed. I never went up there, sir, she told Craddock firmly. Nurse Keene told me the upper rooms were not in use. I cleaned the ground floor, helped in the kitchen, and kept my nose where it belonged. Did you ever see anyone out of place? Mrs. Perry hesitated. Sometimes I'd hear steps, light, slow ones. Once I thought I heard crying, but when I mentioned it, Nurse Keene said it was the wind through the chimney. Did you believe her? Asked Miss Marple gently. The housekeeper looked over at her and gave a small shrug. Not really, but I've seen enough in this life to know some things are better left alone. After the questioning, Craddock and Miss Marple took tea with the Fleetwoods in the drawing-room, which was heavily perfumed, perhaps to mask something less pleasant. Marcus was composed, but Miss Marple noticed the way he clutched his cup with both hands. Cordelia sat stiffly, not speaking. Inspector, Marcus said after a moment, this has been an utter nightmare. And now this attic business. Surely you're not suggesting my sister or I had anything to do with that? Not at all, Craddock said mildly. But we do need to know who lived up there. There was no one, Cordelia said sharply. That room was locked when we arrived. Locked? Miss Marple said, setting down her teacup. With what key? The only ones in the house are those you brought, and those used by the nurse. Cordelia flushed, then turned away. Marcus intervened. It's an old house, Miss Marple. Who knows what keys are tucked away in drawers or wardrobes? Nurse Keene may have used it for storage. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Of course, dear. Though I have always found it rather difficult to store laudanum bottles, worn shawls, and cracked wash basins without a purpose." Cordelia stood. "This is ridiculous. You're wasting your time looking for ghosts when someone out there murdered a woman in our garden." And with that, she swept from the room. Miss Marple watched her go, then turned back to Marcus. "She's very high-strung, your sister." Marcus exhaled, eyes dark with some private burden. "She's been unwell for some time. We came to Fernleigh hoping for peace. Instead—" He trailed off as if the sentence was too heavy to finish. Later, walking back through the garden, Miss Marple bent near the trellis where Nurse Keene had been found. Something glinted faintly in the soil, a small brooch shaped like a forget-me-not, with a pin snapped clean. Miss Marple picked it up with a gloved hand. "Interesting," she said softly. "Quite a sentimental piece, and not Nurse Keene's style at all." As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Miss Marple walked home, deep in thought. A hidden room, an unreported patient, a nurse with secrets, and now a brooch in the garden. The mystery at Fernleigh Hall was beginning to bloom like a rose with thorns. Chapter 4. The Portrait in the Library. The following day brought a peculiar stillness to the village. Rain came steadily down in fine sheets, soaking the hedgerows and turning the paths into slick ribbons of mud. Most villagers remained indoors, fires crackling and kettles singing. But Miss Marple, despite the dreariness, had made up her mind to visit the vicarage. The Reverend Leonard Clement and his wife Griselda had long been friends of Miss Marple's, and the vicar, while always a little startled by her sharp deductions, had come to respect her opinion greatly, especially when it came to matters more troubling than hymn books and jam sales. "I'm afraid," he said, pouring her a second cup of tea, "that Fernleigh is becoming rather like one of those gloomy Gothic novels. Secret attics, hidden lives, and now a murder." "And don't forget the brooch," added Griselda, who, as ever, was more fascinated than shocked by the drama. "What did it look like, Jane?" Miss Marple pulled a small cloth from her handbag and unwrapped the trinket she had found in the garden. It was a delicate piece, though not particularly valuable. A silver forget-me-not with blue enamel petals, now chipped and worn. The clasp had snapped, likely during a struggle. Miss Marple turned it over to reveal a faint engraving on the back. 2H, always. "Sentimental," Griselda murmured. "And definitely not Nurse Keene's," said Miss Marple. "I've never seen her wear any ornament beyond a practical wristwatch. She was a woman of economy, not romance." Leonard frowned. "So someone else dropped it there?" "Or," Miss Marple said gently, "someone left it there a long time ago, and the recent commotion simply unearthed it." Griselda's brow lifted. "You think the death and this attic patient are connected to something even older?" "Possibly. Secrets tend to lie dormant until they don't." After tea, Miss Marple made her way to the village library, a modest stone building staffed part-time by Miss Elspeth Langley, who was more interested in the love lives of authors than their works. Fortunately, she was also an inveterate gossip, and Miss Marple knew how to ask just the right questions. "Dear Nurse Keene," Miss Langley said, wrinkling her nose slightly. "She was always so stiff, not one for light reading, borrowed mostly medical texts or the odd biography. No taste for fiction, imagine." "Did she ever inquire about local records?" Miss Marple asked casually. Miss Langley pursed her lips. "Actually, yes, last spring. She asked for estate maps and family trees, particularly about the Wareham family, who owned Fernleigh before the Fleetwoods." Miss Marple's knitting needles fairly clicked in her mind. "Did she mention why?" "Said she was interested in the hall's history," Miss Langley said with a dismissive wave, "though really, most people are only interested in its ghosts. poor Lady Eleanor jumping from the balcony during the war, and Sir Cedric's odd death in the conservatory. Sir Cedric? Miss Marple repeated. What was odd about it? Oh, some say he had a stroke. Others whispered about poison. The coroner said heart failure, but... She leaned in. He'd disinherited someone in the family just months before, one of the cousins. There was a scandal, money gone missing, I think. But everything was hushed up, of course. Old families never liked dirt being aired. Back at home, Miss Marple sat down by the fire, the facts slowly stitching themselves together like rows of wool. Fernleigh had been inherited, not by direct heirs, but through a lease. There had been a disinherited cousin. Nurse Keene had kept someone hidden upstairs, someone who might have known or been part of that scandal. And now she was dead, struck down while her locked drawers were rifled through. But it wasn't until that evening, over supper, with Dolly Bantry, that another vital thread was drawn in. "You remember dear Madge Willoughby, don't you?" Dolly said, sprinkling salt rather liberally on her potatoes. "She married that dreadful Frenchman and moved to Nice. Well, I had a letter from her just last month. Turns out she'd heard about someone trying to claim the Wareham estate abroad. A woman who said she was the rightful heir." Miss Marple put down her fork. "Really?" "Yes. Claimed she was the daughter of one of the disinherited cousins. Apparently had papers and everything." "That's very interesting, Dolly." "Oh, and get this. She was supposedly quite elderly and not in the best of health. Had a nurse travelling with her?" There was a pause, heavy with implication. Miss Marple dabbed her mouth with a napkin. "You don't happen to remember her name, do you?" "Let me think. Hilda? No, Hildegard. Hildegard Wareham. Quite a name, isn't it?" A name, an engraved brooch, a hidden room, a trail of whispers that led all the way from the dusty halls of Fernleigh to the sunlit coast of France. Miss Marple smiled, not because she had solved the mystery, no, it was not yet ready to be unravelled, but because she could now see its outline taking shape. The past had not remained buried. It had returned, quiet and persistent, wrapped in shawls and laudanum, knocking softly on Fernleigh's attic door. And someone very much alive, had done whatever was necessary to keep it from being opened. Chapter 5. A Visit to the Dead. The sky had cleared by the next morning, and with it came a brittle sort of brightness, cold, sharp, and entirely out of place in St. Mary Mead's usual mellow landscape. Miss Marple stood in her small garden, inspecting the last of the autumn roses, her fingers lightly brushing a fading bloom. Her mind, however, was not in the garden. It was at Fernleigh Hall in the attic, with the ghost of Hildegard Wareham. Miss Marple had been making notes, discreetly of course. She had always found a well-kept household ledger useful in more ways than one. She had jotted down names, connections, half-spoken comments. She had carefully listed the small but telling inconsistencies, the brooch, the nurse's interest in local family records, the presence of laudanum in a room supposedly unused. And now she had another lead to follow. After a brisk walk to the churchyard that lay beyond the vicarage, Miss Marple passed through its creaking gates. She moved among the old stones with a kind of reverence, her sharp eyes scanning the names etched into the lichen-covered marble. Eventually she found what she was looking for, the Wareham family plot. There were several generations buried here, Sir Cedric and his wife Eleanor, a brother, 2 daughters, and a gap. A space where Miss Marple felt quite certain a headstone ought to be. She bent slightly, brushing moss from one of the older stones, and found the name she half expected, Harold Wareham, 1886 to 1937. The disinherited cousin, possibly. There was no mention of wife or child. Miss Marple made a soft The the sort of sound she always made when something didn't fit quite right. Behind her, a voice broke the silence. He was never buried here. She turned to find Cordelia Fleetwood standing nearby, gloved hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked drawn, pale in the sunlight, but less rigid than she had appeared at the house. "Pardon?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Harold Wareham," Cordelia said. "He was disowned. They never forgave him. No one in the family even went to his funeral. There wasn't one, properly speaking. Just a quick cremation in London. No marker, no service." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "And yet you seem to know quite a lot about it." Cordelia gave a short laugh, entirely without humour. "Marcus and I spent months combing through records. Our solicitor insisted on verifying the family tree when we came to claim the Fernleigh lease. We had to know everything." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Even about Harold's daughter?" Cordelia's eyes flinched before she could catch herself. I don't know what you mean." "Miss Hildegard Wareham, allegedly his child, lived abroad, claimed a share of the estate." Cordelia turned away. "She was a fraud." "Was she?" There was a silence, filled only by the wind rattling dry leaves across the gravel path. "We were told the claim was false," Cordelia said finally. "That she couldn't prove it. The birth records didn't match. Our solicitor dismissed it." "Did you?" Cordelia didn't reply. "I believe," said Miss Marple softly, "that Nurse Keene did believe her. Enough to hide her, to care for her, perhaps even to gather proof. That would explain the locked drawers, wouldn't it?" Cordelia's lips pressed together in a tight line. "We didn't kill her?" "I didn't say you did." Miss Marple regarded her quietly. "But perhaps you were afraid that Hildegard's claim, true or not, would cast doubt, delay your inheritance, draw unwanted attention." Cordelia looked at her, her eyes suddenly glistening. "Do you know what it's like to build something for years, only to have it threatened by the past? Fernleigh was supposed to be a new start, for Marcus, for me. Everything we did to protect that." Miss Marple nodded. "Fear is a strong motive, Miss Fleetwood, but it rarely leads to clarity." Cordelia stepped back, straightened, and said in a calmer voice, "If you're suggesting my brother or I had anything to do with that woman's death, you're mistaken." "I rather hope so," said Miss Marple kindly. "But I find in life it is not only what people do that matters, but why they think they had to." Cordelia said nothing more. She turned and walked away across the churchyard, her figure slim and upright against the weathered stones. That afternoon, a fresh twist arrived in the form of young Dr. Edward Merriweather, who had been called in to examine the attic room and review the traces left behind. He visited Miss Marple at tea time under the pretense of returning a borrowed book, and stayed for 2 scones, 3 cups of tea, and a revealing chat. "I wouldn't swear to it," he said, "but someone had definitely lived in that room quite recently. The bedding was removed, yes, but there were traces of hair, skin oils, even crumbs on the floor. Elderly person, most likely, female, likely immobile, judging by the wear on the rug." "And the laudanum?" He nodded. "Enough to dull pain, possibly more. There was also a trace of digoxin in the glass, digitalis, could indicate heart trouble. Or something more deliberate?" "Possibly," he said. "But that dose alone wouldn't kill unless someone increased it." Miss Marple tapped her teaspoon gently against her saucer. "Doctor, forgive me for asking, but is it possible the woman died before Nurse Keene?" He looked at her with polite confusion. "Before? Let us suppose," Miss Marple said, "that Hildegard Wareham, if that was indeed her name, died quietly in that attic room, perhaps naturally, perhaps helped along by someone. Then Nurse Keene, her protector, becomes a liability." Dr. Merriweather looked thoughtful. So someone kills the nurse to stop the truth from coming out? Or to find whatever proof she may have gathered, documents perhaps, a letter or two, and perhaps she had begun to make inquiries about the will, the property, the family line. Dr. Merriweather leaned back. That's quite a theory, Miss Marple. She smiled gently. It's only a puzzle, Doctor, and like all good puzzles, the pieces will fall into place if one has the patience to wait. That evening, Miss Marple returned once more to the brooch, turning it over thoughtfully in the firelight. To H, always. She opened a small tin of keepsakes, old buttons, silver thimbles, a faded theatre programme, and added the brooch to it, just for now. The story of Fernleigh Hall was not yet complete. There was still someone missing, and Miss Marple, with her quiet certainty, knew that once the living were finished speaking, it was often the dead who revealed the truth. Chapter 6. The Visitor at Dusk. It was a damp, dusky evening in St. Mary Mead, the sort that slipped unnoticed from afternoon into night with little ceremony. Lamps were lit early, curtains drawn tight. In Miss Marple's cottage a small fire crackled with polite restraint, giving off more glow than warmth. She sat in her usual chair, knitting needles resting in her lap, her eyes not on the wool, but on the rain-streaked window pane. She had the distinct feeling that something was about to happen. The previous days had brought more than their share of stirrings: Cordelia's troubled confession, the discovery of a secret attic room, Nurse Keene's murder, and whispers of a hidden heir. But there remained, Miss Marple knew, an imbalance to it all. There was something missing from the pattern, something that, when placed correctly, would make the entire picture shift and snap into place. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. It was a hesitant knock, uncertain, almost ashamed of itself. Miss Marple opened the door to find Lily Dawes, the young gardener from Fernleigh Hall, standing beneath the porch, her face pale and pinched, her hair clinging damply to her forehead. "Miss Marple," Lily said in a near whisper. I didn't know who else to go to." "Come in, dear," said Miss Marple at once. "You're soaked through." She led the girl to the fire and fetched her a towel and a cup of tea. Lily clutched it with shaking hands. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, as if afraid something, or someone, might be listening. "I didn't mean to find anything," she said. "I swear I didn't. I was just weeding behind the potting shed." "No one ever goes there, not since the rose trellis fell down. That's when I saw it. An old tin box, all rusted." "What was in it, dear?" asked Miss Marple, gently. "Letters, dozens of them, old ones, from someone named Harold, written to someone called Ellie. I think she must have been Eleanor Wareham, Sir Cedric's wife." Miss Marple's knitting slipped forgotten into her lap. "Go on." "They were love letters," Lily whispered. "And they talked about a child. A little girl they had to keep secret. Harold said he'd found someone to care for her in France. He was worried about money, about someone finding out. He said the family would never allow it." Miss Marple felt a sharp little thrill of confirmation. "And where are these letters now?" I left them where they were. I was scared. I didn't want to get into trouble." "You did the right thing coming here, Lily. Do you think you could show me where the box is?" Lily nodded, a little more colour returning to her cheeks. "Tomorrow morning, then," said Miss Marple, patting her hand, "bright and early. We'll go together." The next day dawned sullen and grey once more, with a low fog clinging to the hedgerows like a secret refusing to lift. Miss Marple and Lily slipped quietly around the back of Fernleigh Hall. The grounds, though better tended of late, still bore signs of long neglect. Brambles clinging stubbornly to the orchard wall, ivy curling over abandoned flower beds. Behind the potting shed, half hidden by a patch of nettles, was the rusted tin box. Miss Marple lifted it carefully, brushing away damp soil. The lid opened with a groan of age. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were the letters. Faded, yellowed, brittle with time, but still legible. Dozens of them, all signed yours ever. H. She read a few, her face drawn tight with quiet concentration. They confirm it, she murmured. Eleanor Wareham and Harold had a child, a daughter they concealed. Likely born while she was still married to Sir Cedric. Such a scandal would have destroyed her, especially in that family. Lily looked troubled. So Hildegard was real then? She wasn't lying? No, my dear, she was very real, and I believe she came back to Fernleigh to claim her birthright. The question is, did someone kill to stop her? Miss Marple delivered the letters to Inspector Craddock that same morning. He sat behind his desk, eyebrows raised so high they nearly vanished into his hairline. Well, this certainly changes things, he muttered, flipping through the aged pages. It gives Miss Hildegard Wareham a strong claim, Miss Marple said calmly. If Nurse Keene was helping her establish that claim, someone might have felt threatened. Craddock gave a long sigh. It also gives motive to nearly everyone in that house. He tapped his pen against the desk. Marcus Fleetwood would lose everything. He has no legitimate connection to the Warehams beyond the lease, and Cordelia, for all her cold exterior, may be more deeply involved than we know. Miss Marple nodded. And yet, I don't believe it was either of them. No, there's something else. Someone we haven't yet looked at properly. Someone who might have moved freely in and out of Fernleigh. Someone overlooked who knew about the attic, the letters, who stood to gain in a way we haven't considered. Any suggestions? Asked Craddock dryly. Miss Marple smiled that faint, grandmotherly smile that so often masked a mind whirring like a well-oiled machine. Let's just say I've begun to see the pattern, but we must be careful. When the truth begins to shine, those hiding in the shadows grow desperate. That evening, as the village prepared for the All Saints' Evensong, a small figure moved quietly through Fernleigh Hall. A door creaked, a drawer was opened. A photograph, long hidden behind a painting, was slipped into a coat pocket. And outside, behind the orchard wall, Miss Marple, ever so still, watched through her spectacles as a shape passed by, unaware it was being observed. Her hands, tucked into her sleeves, did not tremble, because she knew with growing certainty that the story of Fernleigh Hall was on the edge of revelation. But before it could end, one final piece had to be placed, one final trap set. And Miss Marple, who understood human nature like no one else, was just the woman to set it. Chapter 7. A Cup of Tea and a Lie. The next morning, a chill crept into St. Mary Mead with the kind of sharpness that hinted winter was close behind. Frost rimed the edges of window panes, and the last of the village's flowers wilted quietly in the cold. But inside Miss Marple's cosy sitting room, the fire crackled cheerfully, and the old clock ticked with unhurried rhythm. Miss Marple herself sat beside the hearth, her knitting neatly folded in her lap, a tea tray arranged on the table, 3 cups, not 2, because today she expected company. At precisely 10:10 there came a knock at the door, precise, polished, and utterly on time. "Ah, Mr. Fleetwood," said Miss Marple with a smile as she opened the door. "Do come in. You look chilled to the bone." Marcus Fleetwood, as ever immaculate, stepped into the warmth, brushing a few flakes of frost from his overcoat. "Miss Marple," he said politely. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, dear. I thought you might come." "Tea?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. Thank you." They sat. She poured. Earl Grey, just a touch of lemon. I won't pretend, he began, that I've come for a social visit. Inspector Craddock tells me you've found something, a box of letters. Yes, Miss Marple replied gently, though I dare say you already suspected as much. Nurse Keene's drawers had been rifled. Someone was looking for evidence. Perhaps letters very like the ones young Lily Dawes discovered behind the potting shed. Fleetwood's smile faltered. That girl. She's hardly trustworthy. Oh, I think Lily is quite honest, Miss Marple said mildly. She may be a bit rough about the edges, but she has a good eye. And a better heart. Besides, she didn't know what she'd found, but you did. His jaw tensed, but he said nothing. Miss Wareham, she continued, was indeed the illegitimate daughter of Eleanor Wareham and Harold, your ancestor's disgraced cousin. The letters confirm it. So does the photograph found behind the upstairs portrait. A photograph of Eleanor holding a baby on the steps of the French villa. Marcus set his cup down. Even if that were true? Oh, it's true, Miss Marple said softly. And it means that Hildegard Wareham had a very strong legal claim. A messy one, certainly. But she was not a fraud. Nurse Keene, it seems, had spent years verifying the facts. Perhaps she had a sense of guilt. Perhaps she simply admired Miss Wareham's courage. Either way, she brought her back to Fernleigh. She had no right, Marcus said suddenly. This house was supposed to be our fresh start. Miss Marple studied him, her voice still kind. You were once a man of modest means, weren't you? Publishing, yes, but only just keeping afloat. The inheritance changed everything. You'd invested in Fernleigh with your sister. This place, this name, meant security. He looked down. It wasn't just about the money. No, she agreed. It never is. You felt entitled to it. You believed she would ruin everything. So when Nurse Keene began making inquiries, when she started leaving the house with documents, perhaps going to the solicitor, you realized she couldn't be allowed to go further. I didn't kill her, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple gave him a long, quiet look. I don't believe you struck the blow yourself, no. But I think you were part of the plan. Or at the very least, you let someone else do what you hadn't the nerve to. Marcus rose abruptly. You have no proof. I have the truth, she said gently. And very soon the inspector will have the rest. He opened his mouth, but just then there was another knock at the door. Cordelia Fleetwood entered without waiting. She looked tired, more tired than Miss Marple had yet seen her. Her coat was askew, her gloves mismatched. I told him not to come, she said without preamble. I told him to leave it alone. Marcus turned. Cordelia, no, let her finish. Her voice was calm, and something in it, resigned, almost relieved, froze the room. Miss Marple nodded. You were the one who struck Nurse Keene, weren't you? Cordelia didn't deny it. She sat down heavily in the armchair beside the fire. The flames danced in her eyes. She was going to take it all away, she said. Hildegard was already dead by then. She died peacefully. Nurse Keene buried her, I think, behind the old greenhouse. There's fresh earth there, newly turned, and no record of any removal from the grounds. She kept it hidden. But then she started going to the solicitor. She had the letters. She had proof. She only wanted what was hers, Miss Marple said gently. She would have destroyed Marcus, Cordelia whispered. I couldn't let that happen, not again. I've lost everything for him, do you understand? I've lived in his shadow, protected him, given up my own chances. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Marcus said nothing. He looked very small, standing by the hearth. You struck her, Miss Marple said quietly, then searched her room. You found nothing, because she had hidden the box outside with the help of a young girl who didn't know what it contained. Cordelia closed her eyes. I never meant to kill her. I just wanted to stop her. Stop all of it. Miss Marple nodded. But secrets don't stay buried, Miss Fleetwood, not even behind greenhouse walls. There was a long pause. Outside, the clock struck 12. Then very quietly, Marcus said, "We'll go with you." Miss Marple looked at him in surprise. "To the inspector," he said. "We'll tell him everything." Cordelia gave a shaky nod. "It's time." Miss Marple watched them go with a soft sigh. So many tragedies, she thought, come not from wickedness, but fear. Fear of shame, fear of loss, fear of the past. But the past cannot be outrun, only faced. And soon Inspector Craddock would have all the evidence he needed to close the case, but there was still one final truth to uncover. One more revelation yet to come. Chapter 8. Truth Beneath the Ivy. It was a still, frost-tipped morning, the kind of morning where breath hung in the air like smoke, and each step on the grass left a silvered print. The villagers of St. Mary Mead, though always eager for the latest whisper, had grown quieter in recent days. The murder at Fernleigh Hall had touched something older, deeper, and more unsettling than mere scandal. At the vicarage, the kettle whistled merrily as Miss Marple stirred a spoonful of honey into her tea. Inspector Craddock sat opposite her, notebook in hand but closed, more out of habit than necessity now. "Well," he said at last, "it's all been rather neatly concluded. Cordelia Fleetwood confessed to the killing. Marcus, for all his cowardice, gave his full statement. They'll both face charges, of course, hers much more serious." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, but I suspect Cordelia will never fully recover from the weight of what she did. She was not, I think, cruel, only frightened and misguided." Craddock grunted. "She should have let the law handle it. That's what we're for." "Yes," said Miss Marple, smiling faintly. "But human nature is rarely so tidy. She thought she was protecting someone she loved. We often excuse terrible things for that reason." Craddock ran a hand through his hair. "And Nurse Keene?" "She was, in her way, the most honourable of them all," said Miss Marple. "She protected Miss Wareham, not because of blood ties, but because she believed in justice. A quiet sort of justice, the kind that doesn't make headlines." "Hardly the sort of story you'd find in your village magazine," Craddock muttered. "Oh, I don't know," Miss Marple replied with a twinkle. "If Mrs. Price were to get hold of it, she'd have it retold with lace, poison, and a rather passionate foreign affair." Craddock chuckled despite himself. They finished their tea in silence, broken only when Miss Marple, thoughtfully sipping her cup, said, "There is one more thing, Inspector. One small matter I should like to set straight." Craddock looked up, eyebrows raised. "Oh." "The grave behind the greenhouse," she said softly. Cordelia thought it held Miss Wareham, and certainly she believed that. But I'm afraid it wasn't true. He blinked. "Wasn't... but she said..." "I know what she said," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "She believed it." But she was mistaken. That afternoon, under Miss Marple's careful direction, the police returned to Fernleigh Hall. The greenhouse had long since fallen into disrepair, its glass panes clouded with moss, its ironwork rusted through. Behind it, the ground bore signs of recent disturbance. They dug, and indeed there was a body, but it was not Hildegard Wareham. It was Nurse Keene's body, the real Nurse Keene. The woman in the garden, murdered and carefully placed beneath the trellis, had been someone else entirely. Back in her parlour, Miss Marple explained. "It was the brooch that told me," she said. "The forget-me-not, engraved to H always. It belonged to Miss Hildegard Wareham. It was not Nurse Keene's style, too sentimental, too romantic. And it was found near the garden gate, not the attic. That was our first misstep." Craddock sat in stunned silence. "I believe Hildegard Wareham assumed the role of Nurse Keene," Miss Marple continued calmly. "The real nurse was either dismissed or, as we now know, murdered quietly and buried." Hildegard, frail and fading, returned to Fernleigh under the guise of a carer. It was clever. She knew her appearance would go unnoticed. She was elderly, quiet, unremarkable. She had her own motives, and with the help of Lily Dawes and her own documents, she began rebuilding her case. "And the woman found beneath the trellis?" "That," said Miss Marple, "was Hildegard Wareham herself. Cordelia believed she had struck down Nurse Keene. In fact, she struck down the woman pretending to be Nurse Keene." Craddock let out a slow whistle. "So the impersonation worked. She hid in plain sight." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, but there was someone else who knew." "Who?" "Marcus Fleetwood," said Miss Marple, her voice low. "He had been to France. He had met the real Nurse Keene during previous estate matters. He recognized that the woman claiming to be the nurse was in fact someone else, someone from the past. But instead of reporting her, he watched and waited." "He was hoping she'd overstep," Craddock muttered, "give him cause to discredit her." "Precisely," said Miss Marple. "He never imagined his sister would take matters into her own hands." There was a long silence between them. Finally, Craddock shook his head. "All this from a brooch." "Well," said Miss Marple modestly, "human nature is the same everywhere. In the end, it always gives itself away." In the weeks that followed, Fernleigh Hall was once again shut up, its ivy growing unchecked. Marcus Fleetwood was charged with conspiracy and obstruction. Cordelia was taken into custody, her trial expected in the spring. The real Nurse Keene's identity was confirmed, her family notified at last. Miss Hildegard Wareham was buried beside her mother, Eleanor, with a modest but dignified headstone paid for by a solicitor's anonymous client. And Miss Marple, as ever, returned to her knitting and her garden, though every now and then she paused to watch the road that led past Fernleigh, wondering which secret still slept behind its windows. "Funny thing," said Dolly Bantry one afternoon, sipping tea in Miss Marple's parlour. "You always said that house had something hidden." "I did," Miss Marple said, not unkindly. "But then, most old houses do, as do people. It's just a matter of knowing where to look and how to listen." She smiled then, not brightly, but with deep satisfaction. The dead, after all, had spoken, and justice, quiet, unfussy, and complete, had been done.